Welcome to today's webinar, Applied Metabolomics with OMX Testing Case Study Review. Welcome, Dr. Kalish.
Thank you so much. I'm very glad to be here. And let's just get started. So I'll just sort of preface this all by saying, this is an overwhelmingly complicated amount of information that you get from the OMX test. And honestly, very few people in the world understand every one of these markers with great scientific detail. However, in order to get an entirely clinically effective, life-changing program for your typical patient, you don't need to get into the depth and complexity of the test. You just need to know the broad categories and how to interpret them. And if you can figure out four things, neurotransmitters, mitochondria, detoxification pathways, and the different GI markers on this test, with metabolic imbalances kind of mixed in there, you can solve a large percentage of your patient's problems, okay? So the thing is that you don't have to wait until you're an expert at understanding this test to get clinical results. You can get clinical results after today's hour-long talk. I promise you it's true. I've trained hundreds of doctors on how to interpret these kinds of labs. And I see results in people in our mentorship program in like month number 2. They're getting significant patient results using this test. If you just take the simple approach that I'm trying to teach here, okay, and don't psych yourself up too much about understanding every single little thing, just get the broad picture and the broad category. And then you've got it made. And you get a little bit of trust in the process here. So I founded the Kalish Institute in 2006, trained thousands of practitioners, done a bunch of research, worked a lot with patients every day for the last 30 years. It seems like it, but I've been working full-time in practice for a really long time. I still have a part-time practice. But what I'm focused on mostly right now is teaching people how to interpret labs. So now for today's talk, we're going to get into 4 subjects. If you can figure these 4 things out and execute protocols that I'm showing you guys today, maybe 5, 10 patients that you test, you're going to find each one of these things. And when you fix them, you're going to be like, wow, that guy was right. Like, I don't know exactly what every marker means, but I'm getting clinical results because I can see that this section has a problem. And the sections are metabolic dysfunction, and we'll go through that section when we look at labs in a few minutes. Nutritional deficiencies, how to test for and put back in the nutrients that are missing. Mood issues, okay, there's only a couple things you need to know for that category, and then GI complaints. Okay, so these are the 4 areas that we're going to focus on. I'm going to start off with metabolism, prediabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So it's pretty common. Scary number of people, right, in the United States have a metabolic disorder, and it's something that is pretty straightforward to solve. And this is just a slide. You guys can look at this later if you want to read about the details. But the liver itself, right, starts to get deposits of fat, and then it starts to get damaged, and people have lots of big problems. And so the causes are obviously related to lifestyle, obesity, all the things that we're doing to our bodies. There's some genetic component, but most of this is revolved around what people are doing to their bodies physically. And if you want to see it from a more biochemical standpoint, and we're going to look at this on the labs in a minute, is if we consume too much glucose, it can't get into the mitochondria and get used for energy because there's just too much of it, right? And when this goes on for a long enough period of time, we become insulin resistant, and then the situation gets worse and worse and worse. And so all those extra calories, all those extra carbon molecules have to go somewhere, and they eventually find their way into fat, and they get converted into fats in your liver. So your liver, when it's confronted with all these extra calories that it can't use in the mitochondria for energy, turns those extra calories into fat. And that fat accumulates and clogs up your liver. And the main sort of catchphrase around all this is insulin resistance. So if your insulin levels are high because you ate too many carbs, or you ate some sugar, or you drank some alcohol, if your insulin levels are high, it's impossible for your liver to burn fat. Okay, so every moment of the day when you have high insulin, you can't burn fat. And when you're insulin resistant, your body takes all those extra calories and it turns them into fat. They're actually, your liver is producing these fats. And so when you look at these tests, we're measuring a couple of key things. One thing we're measuring is pyruvate or pyruvic acid. Okay, if pyruvic acid goes high, it's a key sign that insulin's not working properly. And it means that the pyruvate, if it's high, it's not going into the mitochondria where it gets converted into acetyl-CoA and you start to make energy out of it. Okay, and again, when there's a buildup of these excess energy units, right, all this extra energy inside the cells, it gets kicked over here and eventually we start to make triglycerides and fats out of it. And this is all happening in the liver. But you can measure this process. And when you look at the organic acids portion of the OMX test, you're going to see pyruvic acid, you're going to see lactic acid. And if those markers are going high, you have the beginnings of metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, whatever you want to call it. So when we look for lactic acid or lactate and pyruvic acid or pyruvate, if those markers are high, you've got a problem. And again, that means that the energy that should be getting burned up is getting converted into fat. And again, this is all happening within your liver. It's kind of a trip. So it's confusing because we eat fat, and that, if you eat too much fat, it's obviously not very good for you. If you eat too low a fat diet, it's not good either. So we eat fat, and that's a little confusing because that fat gets into the bloodstream. But what we're really worried about is when people eat too many carbohydrates, too many sugars, and those sugars get converted into fat within the liver, okay, instead of burned up for fuel. That's really where the big problem is. Then on top of that, you've got this whole thing called beta oxidation, which is also very carefully measured on this test. This test has a whole page of markers, literally a whole page of markers about beta oxidation. That's the process by which we burn fat. So you've got the liver making fat, and you've got the mitochondria burning fat, and then you've got fat that's coming in from your diet. Now, obviously, eating too much fat in your diet is not a good thing and is very unhealthy, but what's even a bigger problem for most of the people that we work with is that they're overeating carbohydrate. That makes them insulin resistant, and then this whole process gets kicked off, okay? And it's a little confusing in my mind because it's not really all about dietary fat. What we're really worried about is the liver producing too much fat. That's the bigger problem. And you can change this with diet. You can change this with supplementation. There's a nice little diagram here that tries to show all that. So let me try to talk you guys through this because it's confusing. You've got the red arrows here, right, which are the things that you don't want to have happen. De novo lipogenesis is the big problem. That's taking simple sugars, carbohydrates, and your body making fat out of them. That's the big problem. And then that fat gets gunked up and screws up your liver in a really big way. Now that could happen with any overconsumption of carbohydrate, which is what most people are overeating. Not too many people overeat fat to the point that they're getting super fat. Most people are overeating carbs. So that's really the bigger problem. Now, of course, saturated and trans fats, they don't do a good thing either if you have too much dietary fat. That's a problem also. But it's a bigger problem with insulin resistance is overeating carbs, because then your insulin goes up, and when your insulin is up, you can't burn fat. When you eat fat, it does not cause a rise in insulin, so you don't have that problem. So carbohydrates cause an even bigger issue with de novo lipogenesis, with the liver making fat, than would if you ate fat. And again, not too many people that I work with are eating enough dietary fat that that's their main problem. It's almost always coming from the carbs, because a little bit of carbs raises your glucose, raises your blood sugar, right? You make insulin in response to that, and that high insulin level is going to create a whole series of problems. And then there's, on the good side, you can do vegetable proteins, fiber, omega-3s, all the things that help balance this out and keep the lipids healthy, the healthy foods that we know about. But you really are looking to avoid the whole insulin resistance problem. And when we look at the labs, I'll go through that in detail. Just remember the back of your mind for a minute. Beta oxidation, pyruvic acid, lactic acid. Here, I'm going to write them down. You write them down too, okay? Beta oxidation, lactic acid, and pyruvic acid. That's the take-home stuff. If you just have those sections memorized, you'll be able to fix metabolic syndrome for a lot of patients. Beta oxidation, pyruvic acid, lactic acid. Just keep that in your head, okay? I wrote it down for you in case, but you should write it down too. All right, so subject number 2, we're going to talk a little bit about micronutrient inadequacies. And you can also look at this test as a micronutrient test, which is kind of convenient. Does a lot of different things. I think of, I mean, to be honest with you, like, I think of micronutrient testing as entry-level testing, okay? So that means that, I mean, really, it's so obvious, right? If you're low in a given vitamin or something, we got to get that vitamin back up, because every vitamin, they're named vitamins because they're essential for life. You can't live without B1. I mean, if all the B1 left your body right now, you'd be dead before you hit the floor. If all the vitamin A was suddenly out of your body, you wouldn't be able to survive. So they name them vitamins because they're vital. They're vital for survival. So at the basic level, you have to restore every nutrient in your patients that are nutrient deficient. And that is just like putting gasoline in a car. Pretty much everybody that owns a car, even if they don't know how to fix a car, understands that they're not going to get anywhere if they run out of gas. So it's very rare that you see, hordes of people by the side of the road that have just run out of gas, because we all just kind of get that, right? And so with vitamins, it's the same thing. Your body's just going to not work. It's just going to stop moving forward if you don't have every single vitamin that you need. So this, again, is very basic, but seems to escape a lot of people. I think this test has a more beautiful and elegant expression when you look at functions like insulin resistance as a function, as a system, and beta oxidation as a system. But we can just all agree that if you're deficient in a nutrient, just replace it. That's a not complex, not controversial kind of concept that we should all be engaging in. And this is a wonderful website. If you guys don't know about it, I look at this website all the time. Oregon State University, the Linus Pauling Institute. Of course, one of my heroes of nutritional medicine, probably same for a lot of you, one of the real geniuses of the last generation. Anyways, this is a great resource. They have all kinds of things. It's free. They have wonderful research, and this is just something I grabbed off their website that shows how nutrient deficient so many of us are. In some cases, the majority of the population is deficient in a whole variety of these nutrients. Let's look at that, okay? And many of these nutrients are tested on this lab, and you're going to see this all the time. So this test measures folate and niacin and riboflavin and thiamine. It kind of indirectly measures vitamin A by looking at oxidative stress. It definitely measures B6 and B12. Vitamin C is measured. E is measured because they're looking at antioxidants. So it's measuring many of the most common deficiencies. You can also see there's not a direct measure of magnesium, but there's indirect ways you can see when magnesium is low on this particular test. Okay, so that's item number 2. Item number 1 is how we deal with fat. Item number 2 is nutrient deficits. And then item number 3 is thinking about dopamine and serotonin and how those chemicals work. And this is all on the lab. You're going to see these markers. They're really simple to interpret, and you should be able to figure that out in 2 or 3 months if you're lucky. You put some work into it. So dopamine and addiction. Dopamine is probably the most important of these brain chemicals from the work that I've done, the research that I've done. If you get dopamine levels restored, it has an effect on many of the other brain chemicals. So it's sort of, in many ways, the central player. Serotonin may get more airtime, but dopamine seems like the place to start for a lot of our patients. And so dopamine is it's sort of the neurotransmitter of our era, right? In relation to addiction, whether you're addicted to your iPhone, you're addicted to medications, you're addicted to prescription drugs, you're addicted to recreational drugs. The way that the brain works is we're making these chemicals, neurochemicals, neurotransmitters. And in the case of dopamine, we take an amino acid called tyrosine, convert it into L-dopa, and then make dopamine. And then that dopamine is squirted out from the presynaptic neuron, and then it hits the postsynaptic neuron over here and triggers a reaction. And then ideally, the dopamine then is pulled back in through a transporter into the neuron where it was made, and it's put back inside a vesicle there. So we can measure this entire process with this test. You can measure tyrosine. You can measure the metabolites of dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine, all of those, okay? All those can be measured, the breakdown products of these, okay? And that gives you direct insight into how much dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine is in the body. And the same is true for serotonin. So you could just put serotonin right here. Serotonin is made from tryptophan. You can measure tryptophan with this test, and you can measure the breakdown products of serotonin as well. Okay, so that's all easily measured. And you can see from the lab where there's a problem. And in our culture now, and I'm a victim of this too, like, I mean, it's a really big deal when I put my phone down. When I put my iPhone down, I go for a bike ride, you know, for an hour. I feel a little nervous about that. I'm like, well, I'm going to be out of touch for an hour. What if I get a flat tire? What if the world ends? You know, well, I won't be able to check the news or get any text messages. What if somebody texts me? You know, so like that's addiction, and it's the same process as it is with drugs like cocaine and amphetamines. When you do a medication, when you do a drug like cocaine or an amphetamine, you get a sudden block of these reuptake ports and a flooding of the dopamine into the synapse where it has this huge effect. But every time you get a little ding on your iPhone and you are looking down at it, oh, like, you know, you don't wait for 10 minutes and then look at it, you look at it right away. That little ding, that little reward behavior is a little push of dopamine. So we're constantly being stimulated with our dopamine, and very few people can, you know, avoid the trap of having this stuff get burned out. And you can measure it all, okay? So you can measure the metabolism related to fatty liver. You can measure the nutrient levels that are essential for life. You can measure this. And then here's a more detailed breakdown on the pathway. This is right out of the OMX guide. Here's our tyrosine. And we're keeping this simple, right? This is kind of complicated here, but all you need to know is that tyrosine is how you make dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. And on the test, we're going to measure these funny sounding things like vanil-mandelic acid. That's a metabolite or a breakdown product of norepinephrine and epinephrine. Now, norepinephrine is the same as noradrenaline. Epinephrine is the same as adrenaline. And you can tell by the way the words sit up, right? So epi is above, nephrin is kidney, epinephrine. Adrenaline, AD is above, adrenaline, renal is the kidney, adrenaline, right? So either way, whether it's the Latin or the Greek, it's the same thing, epinephrine and adrenaline, norepinephrine and noradrenaline. I like to use the term adrenaline because most patients are familiar with the term at least because they know, oh, I got an adrenaline rush. Yeah, we're measuring your adrenaline, or epinephrine and norepinephrine. Those are the catecholamines. And we measure them by looking at vanil-mandelic acid. That's on the test. Simple, dimple. Dopamine is measured by its metabolite, homovanillinic acid. Again, couldn't get much easier than that. And forget about all these other things. They're extra and you don't really need to know about them. You just need to know if one of these things is messed up, homovanillinic acid or vanil-mandelic acid, you give the patient tyrosine and they're going to feel better. It's that simple, okay? It really is. You can learn all these other things later if you want, and it's just absolutely not necessary in order to get people better. Now, on the serotonin side, we have tryptophan, which we're going to measure, which converts to serotonin and then gets converted into 5-hydroxyindoleacetic acid. And that's what we're measuring. We're measuring the 5-HIAA over there and the tryptophan. All these other things you can learn later. You know, really, it's like too much information otherwise. The only other thing you should probably know on here is the kynurenic acid and quinolinic acid, because those are elevated when there's inflammation or a cytokine burst of cytokines. So kynurenic acid and quinolinic acid, keep your eyes on those because those show that there's a problem with the brain. But really the main one you want to look at is the 5-HIAA and the tryptophan levels itself, and there's serotonin right in the middle. And it's simple. If these markers are off, if tryptophan is off or 5-HIAA is off, you give the support for the serotonin, and they're going to start to feel better in a couple of weeks. You don't have to memorize all these other complicated pathways, right? So the last section is we did non-alcoholic liver, nutritional deficiencies, mood, which is serotonin and dopamine, and then there's a whole section on this test that looks at GI. GI symptoms are incredibly common. You know, like almost half the population has heartburn, which is a little scary if you think about it. Oh my gosh. You know, it's not too surprising that if you've been in practice for a while. So super common. You add all these things up, it's almost everybody in the United States has some kind of problem with their gut. And so I'll show you how to look at the gut markers in a second too. So now I'm just going to segue over here, and we're going to go back and talk about each of these things that but look at it from the lab perspective. Now we're going to look at this first test here in relation to metabolic syndrome. All right. And so the markers on here that are the most important, and you can see it on the summary page, are glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and what I just said there, beta oxidation. Yeah. So those particular markers are what we were just talking about in terms of let me show you back here. Okay, this is what we're looking at. We're looking at the body's ability to take glucose and put it through the mitochondria and end up making energy out of it. That's kind of the goal. Okay, so now when we're talking about anything to do with metabolic syndrome, so that's insulin resistance, fatty liver, obesity, could even trickle out to cardiovascular disease and high blood pressure and all those kinds of things. Remember I said on the earlier part of the talk that we're looking at, just think of two markers. That's all I want you to focus on, because these are the two that matter the most. And they're pyruvic acid and lactic acid. That's it. Just ignore the whole rest of this thing for now, because if these are high, either of these are high, you've got metabolic syndrome. And we saw earlier on that diagram, if pyruvic acid, also known as pyruvate, is going up, it means that the energy is not going into the mitochondria effectively to make ATP, and so it's building up, and your liver's making fat. And if lactic acid is high, the same thing. And sometimes you'll see both of them high. And again, I know it's oversimplifying things, but these are the most important markers on here, and they're the ones that are the most consistent for the people that we're worried about. You can almost ignore the whole rest of this part of the test. Either one of these high or both of these high, you've got a major problem with metabolic syndrome, and you're going to want to fix it. All right, so let's take a look here. So if you see high pyruvic acid and high lactic acid, then the protocols are incredibly simple. You're going to use B complex, a good, strong B complex, and you're going to use something else called lipoic acid. Typically going to get that in a 300 milligram capsule and give 1 to 2 of those twice a day. Anything that's metabolic related, you're going to also want to use magnesium, some kind of magnesium chelate. Those are usually in a 100 milligram capsule. And when it's lactic acid in particular, but pyruvic acid also a little bit, you're going to want to use CoQ10. These are the nutrients that get those enzymes working properly. And the enzymes that we're talking about are pyruvate dehydrogenase, right there. That's the one that regulates pyruvic acid, and lactate dehydrogenase, the one that regulates lactic acid. So if pyruvic acid is high, you want to tweak this enzyme here, push it to work more effectively using B vitamins, lipoic acid, magnesium, and CoQ10. The same thing with lactic acid. It's really that simple. And it doesn't have to get more complicated than that at all. And there's the actual protocol right here, okay? You can also use, and all the companies that we work with make blood sugar stabilizing supplements. And you could add that in here. And they usually are going to have chromium and vanadium and things like that. So if you have room in the program to add in additional blood sugar support, it works better. And that would be basically a core program for reversing insulin resistance or reversing metabolic syndrome. And of course, you got to do all the dietary changes and all that other stuff too. That's kind of like a given, you know, that you're going to be doing that as well. All right, so now let's take a look at another lab here. And the thing is that you know, I've been studying this stuff for 30 years. I spent the last 10 years working with Richard Lord twice a week, which is like being in a graduate school program. And I can't tell you the number of things that I've learned, but as I've learned more and more and more, my programs that I design get simpler and simpler and simpler. Like the programs that I design for patients, I'm not just saying this because this is like a webinar and I want, this is actually what I do in my practice. Like right here, this is it. It doesn't get more better than this. You can't, if you spent 10 years studying with Richard Lord, who's a scientist that originally developed this test back in the 80s, you would still do this, okay? That's why I'm saying the test can be intimidating, but this is the protocol, and it's not as bad as it seems. And you're not, I was talking to this doctor yesterday, and she's like, oh, I started my practice, but I'm only charging $200 an hour because everyone else in town in this area in Colorado, knows more than I do. And I'm like, that's not how it works. You don't like discount your rate because you're new. She's using the same protocols that I'm using, right? It's the same, she's delivering the same service. She should be charging the same amount. So you guys should have the confidence to do this and just use this program. It's the same thing that somebody like me who's been studying this stuff for 30 years uses. You're going to get the same quality of results as I do. And honestly, you don't need to be able to interpret the test anything beyond what I just said, pyruvic acid and lactic acid. Oh, and I forgot one thing. Hang on a second. Remember how I said there's a whole page on beta oxidation? Fatty acid oxidation. This whole page is dedicated towards the process of burning fat. If you see these markers high here, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of these markers high, they have a beta oxidation problem, okay? And it doesn't have to be all the markers high. It could be one that's super high. It could be 2 or 3 that are high. But if these markers are high, you have a beta oxidation problem. Then we would go back to our basic metabolic program here, and we would add in carnitine. L-carnitine, usually it's sold in like a 500 milligram capsule, and you want at least 2,000 milligrams a day. So you want at least 2 of those in the morning and at least 2 of those later in the day. And that's for beta oxidation. That's for fat burning. Okay, so we're talking about preventing fat from being made. That's what the top part of this program is all about, glucose stabilization. That's preventing your liver from making fat in the first place. And then carnitine or beta oxidation is about burning up the fat that you do have. And obviously these two things work together. You burn up the fat that you do have with the carnitine. You stop making all this extra fat in your liver with the other parts of this program. Why? Because you're reversing the insulin resistance. When people are insulin resistant, their liver goes a little cuckoo and makes tons of fat. So you're reducing the production of fat in the liver and you're burning up the fat that's lying around, and then obviously metabolic syndrome gets better. So again, let me go back one more time. Fatty acid oxidation, this whole page, you see 1 or more markers high, give the carnitine. How much? 2,000 a day. On this page, we're ignoring everything else because we're just starting out. Pyruvic acid high, treat it. Lactic acid high, treat it. Both of them high, for sure, treat it, okay? And that's metabolic syndrome in a nutshell. Okay, so metabolic syndrome, super simple. One more time, show you the protocol. B complex, lipoic acid, magnesium, CoQ10. Like this is a blood sugar product. If you want to add in some extra, that's a question mark. And then in the case of beta oxidation problems, you're adding in carnitine. Okay, so that's plan 1. Now let's look at plan 2. So now we're thinking about, we're going to kind of cruise through this section because we don't care about that for this patient. Now we're thinking about neurotransmission. And I know this seems wrong. We're ignoring huge portions of this test. You just have to trust a little bit that we're going to look at the most important parts. And then that's really what's going to matter. These are the things that move the needle with patients. So when we were talking about dopamine, we looked at tyrosine. If tyrosine levels are low, you absolutely have to supplement with tyrosine. And then remember we saw the metabolites, homovanillinic acid and vanilmandelic acid. If those are either extraordinarily high or low, you've got a problem with your catecholamines. So this person has both high vanilmandelic acid and low tyrosine. They have to take these nutrients in order to normalize brain chemistry. And then the symptomatology behind this is things like ADD, ADHD, depression, anxiety, compulsive drinking, compulsive anything, OCD, all that kind of stuff. All right, so now we go on to the second portion, and you see for serotonin function, tryptophan in this case is low. And by the way, I see cases like this all the time. Tryptophan is low, and our 5-HIAA is low. And we're ignoring everything else here in general. But here's our quinolinic acid. That means that there's some neuroinflammatory, neurotoxic process going on. This is not a good thing. So the brain is inflamed, okay? But that's not important because we're just going to fix the serotonin, the person's going to get better. So then they need tryptophan to balance out their serotonin. This is the metabolite of serotonin, which is low, and this is tryptophan, from which we make serotonin. That's all you need to know. You can ignore the whole rest of this page for the first year or two that you do this. You can fill in, you can learn what xanthinic acid is for later, you know, you really can. And you should, but you don't need to know that stuff to get started and to help people dramatically. All right, so now can we do one more program here? And you know, I know when I first met Dr. Timmons and I was first learning how to do this stuff, I thought, gosh, this is a nice older guy. You know, he was probably like my age. He was in his late 50s, but I was like 28, so I thought he was really old. So this is a nice older guy. He's a naturopath. I don't know. It seems like he knows what he's doing. I just trusted him. He just seemed like one of those people that you should trust, you know, there's just like his personality. And I just did, for the first 2 or 3 years, I just did everything he said just based on belief. And everybody was getting better all the time, so I just kept believing in it. So there's a moment when you're starting with this kind of a complex lab, you just have to find somebody and just trust them. And I hope most of you trust me. If you don't trust me, you know, go somewhere else and do another conference or seminar with someone else. But find someone that you do trust, okay? Because once you get that person, you just do what they say, and then it works. You're like, oh, that wasn't so bad, was it? So this person needs tyrosine, and we just saw that. Remember, their tyrosine was low. Just give them 1,000 milligrams 3 times a day. And they needed tryptophan. Don't do all of this at the same time. I'll describe that in a minute. They need a tryptophan. Comes in a 500 milligram. Usually those are best done at night because they make people sleepy. And most people low in tryptophan are kind of not sleeping very well anyways. And then to make these neurotransmitters, to produce these neurotransmitters, you have to have vitamin C, calcium, folate, B6, and probably some kind of sulfur compound. So most of the time, the easiest way to cover all of that is with a multi-pack. All the companies have them. You give a good quality multi-pack. It might be once a day, it might be twice a day, depending on the company. But that's going to have B6, folate, calcium, all that stuff in it. It won't work. The programs won't work without the multi. Okay, you have to have that kind of robust multivitamin / multi-pack. And the ones that I use is like 4 pills in the morning, 4 pills at night. You kind of load yourself up on it. So I would start the first week with the tyrosine, 2 pills 3 times a day with food. See how they're doing. After a week or 10 days, if that's going okay, then add in the tryptophan at night. So you're boosting up the dopamine first. That has profound effects on the entire brain. Remember I said in the beginning, tyrosine or correcting dopamine affects all the neurotransmitters. So correcting the dopamine is going to affect the entire brain in different ways, in good ways, right? And then you add in the tryptophan around week 2 or so and do that one at night. And I've used this protocol, I don't know, for maybe 20 years with thousands of patients. And, you know, it doesn't really matter if they're depressed or anxious or have ADD, ADHD. It really doesn't matter what the mood problem is. It's the brain chemicals that we're correcting that we're going after, right? So that's a pretty straightforward program. But don't forget the multi-pack, because the most important determinant of whether this is going to work or not is vitamin B6. So in other words, you could do all this stuff that we're talking about, and if the person doesn't have enough B6, it's not going to work. So that becomes incredibly important, the B6 part, right? And so we were talking about this in class yesterday, I think, in my mentorship program. So the mentorship program is the best class. It's the 1-year class that I teach, okay? Some of you guys will eventually take it. But we were talking about, or I was talking about when I first started working with Dr. Timmons, I first started doing labs, and I ordered an organic acids test. This is a true story. I ordered this organic, and I was in my late 20s, early 30s, something like that. I was like 32 years old or whatever. It was before I had kids. I ordered an organic acids test, and I thought he'd be kind of excited about it because he was like a lab guy. His whole life revolved around lab, like literally his whole life. He didn't have free time. He didn't have friends that were outside the lab world. He had a lot of friends, but all his friends ran labs and did labs and all this kind of stuff. And so I ordered this organic acids test, and I just remember showing it to him, and I remember him looking at me and just shaking his head and going, he used to call me Danny Boy because he's Irish now, and my name is Dan. So he just shook his head, Danny Boy, and I could just tell I did something, really wrong. And he looked at the lab and he said, did you do a GI test yet? And I was like, no, I didn't. And then he said, well, what about all these nutrient deficits? Do you think that could be coming from this person's gut? And I was like, I don't know, maybe. What do you think? And then I realized, so point is that the way that I was trained, you really couldn't and shouldn't do a ton of nutrient replacement until you test and correct the gut. Now, in my senior years, as I'm approaching 60, I kind of understand the logic there. So I'm just going to mention that we are assuming that as part of your basic workup, you guys are ordering GI maps and you're testing and correcting the GI tract as well. Okay, and this is a GI map. We just pulled this one. This is from one of the mentorship students from this week. This is a 30-something-year-old hairdresser who has a lot of environmental toxin problems, but she's also got H. pylori, some low commensal bacteria, a little bit of dysbiosis, but not too bad, and a little bit of Dientamoeba fragilis. I don't know if you can have a little bit of that in a good way, not really. So she has D. fragilis, which is a parasite, and super high secretory IgA. Clearly, she's got a ton of problems going on with the GI, right? And so when you see that, you realize that nutrient absorption is compromised. And then when you look at a very complex nutritional evaluation like the OMX, you just have to think, okay, some of this is diet related, some of this is genetics, and some of this is absorption. And if her gut's not working well, the absorption has got to be fixed as part of an integrated program. Okay, so I just want to mention that. And so nutrient deficits. Now we're going to look at some sections of this test because it's such a big test, but we're just showing you the most important parts. Well, that doesn't look very good, does it? Look at that. Okay, well, we can focus in on nutrients on this one, so let's do that. All right, and I'm going to keep it simple. Ooh, that doesn't look good, does it? So there's a little bit of overlap here, as you can already see. So we've got pyruvic acid here under the nutrition category, but also these branched chain alpha keto organic acids. Those are really important. Alpha keto glutaric acid, methylmalonic acid, formiminoglutamic acid, xanthurenic acid, and beta hydroxyisovaleric acid. So I'm just going to hit on the highlights of these. This is like, I'm really into Johnny Cash. I don't know if you guys like Johnny Cash. I really like him a lot. But I have his Best Hits album on my iPhone. And I listen to that all the time, like once a week probably. And so I don't listen to all his songs, but there's like 10 or 15 of them I really like. So we're not going to do every nutrient marker on here. This is like a best hits kind of moment. But these are the ones that you absolutely have to know. You have to use these every day or you're going to be in some serious trouble, okay? Because you're going to miss stuff. Not you're going to be in trouble with me, like I'm going to get upset, but you're going to be in trouble because you're going to miss things. You're going to feel bad about that. So just get out a pen and jot these things down because these are the ultra important ones. If methylmalonic acid is high, there's a B12 deficiency. And later on, you can look up, Google, what does B12 do? And you'll see, oh, okay, that one's kind of important for energy and for this and that and that. So methylmalonic acid high, very specific indicator of low B12. And low B12 is not negotiable. You have to have B12 to methylate. You have to have B12 normal cardiovascular function, nervous system function. It's pretty important. Formiminoglutamate or formiminoglutamate acid going high means the patient's low in folate. Equally important. sustaining of life folate. Okay, so if you see that one high, you give them folate. And again, we're just doing the best hits here. We're not going to do them all. If xanthrenic acid is high, they have a B6 deficiency. And B6 is involved in just about everything you could think of in your body. If you have a B6 problem, your neurotransmitters don't work, your detox doesn't work, you can't make any hormones. I mean, it's critical, B6. And then the last one of this sort of hit list is beta hydroxyisovaleric acid, which is a marker for biotin. Biotin is really important for blood sugar, nervous system function. So we've got B12, folate, B6, and biotin, those four. Just think about those four. But remember, if there's a whole bunch of nutrient deficits, then you're thinking, I wonder, does this person have a really bad diet? Or do they have an absorption problem? And in all the years of doing this work, I was thinking about this yesterday. Almost all of the problems that I see on OMX tests are generated by either genetics or something that's wrong with the body. Like the person is exposed to a toxin, or they got an infection in their gut or something like that. There's not that many people that have food as the main problem. Now, diet always contributes to every condition that we work with, but you can have a lot of patients who will radically improve their diet, and years later they come to see you and they've been eating healthy for a long time, and yet their lab looks like this. And I had a woman was asking me this yesterday. She was like, she lives on an organic farm. She runs an organic farm with her husband. And she was like, can't we just eat blah, blah, blah to get my B vitamins back? I'm like, I don't know. You've been eating like that for 8 years. Did it work? And she's like, well, I guess not. I mean, they've been running this organic farm for 8 years. They still have these nutrient deficits. So we're assuming that you're doing the dietary coaching and getting people on good diets. And then we're saying if that's not enough, then we're going to do use these different nutrient replacement strategies, okay? But these are not replacements for a good diet by any means. And let me just review one last thing here for you guys, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So remember, lactic acid, high. Problem with insulin resistance, pyruvic acid, high. A lot of doctors believe that these two markers are the most important markers on this entire test. Why? Because if you're insulin resistant, really bad things happen all throughout the body. It's a central pathway. If all you did was correct insulin resistance in every person that you worked with, you'd probably get most of them better. This is a very central process. That's why I'm dwelling on it so much. Either these markers are high, you do that metabolic protocol that we already put together there a minute ago. Okay, and then we're ignoring the rest of this for now because it's complicated and you can't learn it all at one time. But then we're looking at this page, remember, the beta oxidation or fatty acid oxidation page. And if you see these markers high, then you're thinking, oh, they're not burning fat very well. Okay, high markers here. They're not burning fat very well. I'm going to use carnitine. Now, let's open it up for questions.
Okay, if someone has GI issues, gas, bloating, but you also suspect adrenal issues as well as metabolic syndrome, would you start with a stool testing, OMX, or adrenal testing?
I think the best way to answer that is in order to correct the gut, you have to look at it as an integrated program. So when I think about doing a gut program, it includes all the lifestyle changes and working on the adrenals at the same time. But you're not going to get too far if you separate those out. That's why I do a lot of classes where I teach adrenal and gut programs together. So those two pair together really well. And if you're going to start a program, it's better if you can do the adrenal and GI testing together as the initial workup. Once you get that under control, the next step would be something like an OMX or organic acids test. That's the best way to do it, is adrenals and GI together, and then OMX as the follow-up, assuming that the patient doesn't want to do all the labs at the same time.
And I'd like to thank you, Dr. Kalish. For more information about testings offered by Diagnostic Solutions Laboratory, please visit diagnosticsolutionsLab.com. Thanks again, and everybody have a great day. Thank you, Dr. Kalish.
Bye now.